prescription for a republic of hope and a country which we've got our last title for today from that poem, Let My Country Awake. But very quickly, let's speed into the next session, which continues our programming for today, which is Our Republic. So I'd like to welcome Avirook Sen in Calcutta, because he's Avirook elsewhere. So Avirook Sen and Debnita Chakravarti on a session on his recent book, Aarushi. So the session's name is Aarushi and the Indian Mind. And those who wish to get their books signed by Harsh and Ruchira, our bookstore is just outside the East Gate. Please go and get your copies signed by them. Over to you, Debnita, and welcome, Avirook.
Kolkata Literary Meet. Welcome, Avirook. Welcome to Kolkata. Is this your first KLM session?
My first KLM session, but I'm from here,
yes.
So it's very familiar to lots of friends.
But the first time you've been at the literary...
At this Lit Fest, yes.
Right. You've been touring the literary festivals, all of them, in the last few months. How has KLM or Kolom been so far? Good
I've
experience?
kind of only just got here, but
right.
I am now... My friends call me a Lit Fest tramp.
Right.
So I'll give you my review
right.
once I'm done.
Right.
But it's very exciting to be here. Yeah.
Right. As we call it, KLM or Kolom, as we like to call it, is very close to our hearts. So we are always greedy for a little praise. Avirook, as you all know, is a known name in journalism, has been for the last 25 years. And this session is about his second book, Aarushi, on the Aarushi Hemraj double murder, a case which from day one has gripped public imagination firmly, and even today, almost 8 years on, refuses to let go. Since the book came out July 2015, it's been the subject of a lot of discussion, debate, and today's session, I think, is different from all the KLM sessions we've been having so far, because all of you are aware of the case. You've lived with it for the past 8 years. And I think all of you have very strong views on it and a lot of questions about it, like I do as well. We'll try and keep as much time as possible for all your questions in the end. And but I would like to... I'm sure you all... know the basics, but just so that we are on the same page and for helping the subsequent discussion, I'll try and put it, the main facts, in a couple of sentences. Please correct me if I miss or go wrong somewhere. Aarushi Talwar was found murdered in her bed, 16th May 2008. The next day, the domestic help Hemraj was found murdered on the terrace. Within a week, Noida police had arrested her father, Rajesh Talwar. By the end of the month, the CBI takes the case over. Next month, however, the narco-analysis tests and other, the brain mapping, etc., prove that Rajesh Talwar's assistant Krishna and his two acquaintances, Rajkumar and Vijay, were present at the scene of the crime. Not 4 people then, but 3 more. Arrests are made, Rajesh Talwar is released. But by September, they are all let free because of lack of conclusive evidence. There can be no charge sheet brought against them. 2009 and 10, I think, we see a lot of twists and turns in the case, CBI bringing up new evidence, going back on what they said previously. By the end of 2010, there is a closure report by the CBI, lack of conclusive evidence to convict Rajesh Talwar. But the Talwars are unhappy with this report and want further investigation. Beginning of 2011, the closure report is made into a charge sheet, and the Talwars are at the focus of the investigation, again at the they are the prime suspects once again. Trial starts mid-2012, 4th June, I think, around. And by the end of 2013, on the 26th of November, they are sentenced to life imprisonment. They are at Dasna jail, awaiting an appeal, which And that is the present situation now. So I think we have to begin by asking the question that we wake up to murders every day. Why is this special? Why is this different?
Yeah, for a number of reasons actually. And when I started covering the case, it is not that I felt in any way that this was special. As journalists, you develop a fairly thick skin about this because, like you said, it's a daily event, quotidian. However, as a journalist, what I found as I covered the trial was that not only was the story very compelling, and it kind of sucked me into it, but really the story lay elsewhere. And which is why Aarushi is not merely, I think, a book about a murder and who did it or who didn't do it. It speaks to many aspects of India. How do we run our institutions, for instance? What is our media like? How do we consume media? In many ways, this is a book about us, and the story is about us. That's why the book, for me, it went well beyond the murder to a much bigger story. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've called our session today, Aarushi and the Indian Mind. So there are lots of things to talk about in a case like this, the nitty-gritties of a case which has gone on this long, accumulated so many characters, so many incidents, so many surprises. And also for me personally, the writing of the book, because it's what you might call a non-fiction novel or a faction as it's popularly called. But we are not going to go into that at all. We are going to try and see why this case tells us a lot about not only how our judicial system works, but how our society at large works. I think that is a very interesting thing that has come up. And after this book was published, I think it's constantly been the subject of debates which has led to a very strong divide between people. I'm sure you've all seen the News Hour debate where it was made into, questions were asked as to why nobody came to speak for Krishna, Rajkumar and Vijay, whereas there are so many voices in support of the Talwars. Why is it being made into a class issue, do you think, Avirook?
So not for the first time I disagree with what or what not the nation wants to know. I disagree first and foremost that there were many voices for the Talwars. There were a few, yes. But it's not about for or against the Talwars. For me, this case and why this sort of debate has come up is primarily because of one reason, that's a civilizational principle. And that is the presumption of innocence when anyone is charged with anything. This is a principle as old as civilization itself, and it goes back to well before times when laws were codified. Now, this case is special because that principle was overturned, or the opposite seemed to have applied at 3 or 4 different levels. It applied, of course, at the level of the judiciary. It applied to the way the case was investigated. It applied to how the media covered the case. And it applied to how we, as a reading or viewing public, consume the case. In each of these areas, presumption of innocence was overturned to be replaced by presumption of guilt. And that is, to me, a telling statement about the kind of India that we live in. This is not to say that in every sort of walk of life or aspect of India that it's only the negative that applies. But this case, and the very fact that we can have even one case like this, tells you about its acceptability, the acceptability of that reversed civilizational principle, which is the presumption of guilt. everybody who read the newspapers thought straight away the parents must be guilty. Everybody, almost everybody who covered as media people, as journalists, this case, thought the parents were guilty. The same debate that you talked about, I was on it. One of the things that struck me about that was a self-congratulatory tone. And it suggested that, look, we had said these people were murderers all along, and now the court has confirmed what we always told you. So are we not great? I mean, I think I remember stepping in and saying that we don't need the certificate of the coverage of this case to let us as media professionals know that we are doing a great job. There are many other areas perhaps, because this to me is one of the cases where in fact the opposite applied. The coverage was biased. It was and in many cases, in many instances, there was a suspension, I think, of rationality in the way that it was reported. I'll give you an instance. One of the prosecutions or the CBI's stories around this case was that, and I kid you not, that DNA can be wiped off because there is alcohol present somewhere in the neighborhood. Or that if I mix two blood groups and put it in a bottle, I can take, without any sophisticated instruments, I can clean one set of blood and leave the other. To not question any of this was a big failure on the part of my community, the media. And we have to at some stage put our hands up and say, look, this is what happened and perhaps we should be correcting it. So that's one of the purposes of this book as well.
I know, I mean, while reading the book, I was struck by the fact that there's so much debate about the exact weapon that killed Aarushi, whether it was a scalpel or a golf club or a hammer. But there's really no doubt about what murdered the justice for Aarushi, and it was the typo. The number of typos that this case has cited is amazing. I had a mind to sit down and make a list sometime, maybe.
I mean, the critical thing about this case, I'll just return to, I think, a point that you mentioned earlier, which is, what about the story of the servants? Why is this story only about Aarushi and not about the other victims? All right, let's accept that that may have been the case. And now let's look at the narrative as it is. What the CBI tells you is that this manservant, who's about in his late 40s, is actually having intercourse with a 13-year-old. And they both get killed as an act of revenge, or, or what they call in what was described as an honor killing. Now, if we accept the narratives, just say we accept it for a moment, then the servant Hemraj, who there are a lot of bleeding hearts about anyway, the servant Hemraj, before he is a victim, he is a rapist, because the girl was 13. That's under the law, that's statutory rape. If you then shout that the Talwar's being convicted is justice for Hemraj, then you are also accepting that Hemraj was a rapist. That part of the narrative is somehow conveniently forgotten when this whole aspect of class comes into it. Personally, I don't even think class has such a large role to play in this. Sure, class plays a role in everything that we do in India. This is, it's a given. So to say that it's completely removed from this case would also be wrong. But is it the cause, or is it why the case panned out this way? No. That blame rests, partly with the investigators, partly with the media, and partly with us.
There was a feeling so many times in this case that the CBI was under tremendous pressure to bring things to a closure. Do you think that's true for every one of us? We want a conclusion, and because those three men, Krishna, Rajkumar, and Vijay, were not at the scene, and the Talwars were. Do you think that there's this impatience on the part of the people as well? And it was a media by trial in that sense that they were.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, so let me just explain this. The CBI, one of the smallest parts of its job really is to investigate crimes such as this. The much bigger sort of brief that they have is on things like economic offenses or anti-corruption. That's really their brief. However, special crimes, as this set of crimes is called, gets a disproportionate amount of media coverage. As a result of which, every CBI director coming in is very frequently asked about, unfinished business. Why haven't we closed this case? What are you people doing about this one? In the case of Aarushi, try and remember one thing, that the media coverage is such that I think for probably the only time in its history, news stories around the Aarushi Talwar case got higher ratings than the IPL. People were watching this case with more interest than they were watching cricket. That is a big statement about India in the first place. So there was immense media pressure. What happened was that of the 5 suspects, 3 had disappeared. They went into they just vanished in some way.
They could be anywhere.
So they went off to Nepal or wherever, got lost in Chandni Chowk, wherever they were. The only 2 people left, the only 2 people who could help the agency to bring closure were actually the 2 people who were also cooperating the most. And this was the parents. So out of 5, you have only 2 left. And if you want to close, then it's got to be these 2. So in the end, what the CBI does, to its immense discredit, I think, is reverse engineer a case. And doesn't even do a very good job of that, because there are innumerable instances within, as exposed on the trial, of manipulation and even fraud. The typo you mentioned, quite simply, went like this. I'll just explain a bit of the background. You see, what happened is the only piece of hard evidence at all ever found in this case, which seemed to incriminate somebody, was traces of the victim Hemraj's blood on a pillow cover that belonged to one of the other suspects. Now, when this was pointed out by the Talwars to the CBI, saying, look, here is fairly hard evidence. The least you can ask this man is, how, sir, does a victim's blood end up on your bedding, whereas you live several blocks away, several houses away? Now, what the CBI does is, faced with this, having already made a case for against the Talwars, what they do is they go back to the forensic lab and write a letter to the forensic lab saying that, look, there appears to be a typo. And really, Hemraj's blood was never really found on the pillow cover of this man, Krishna. So please correct the typo. So a forensic report changes. Now just imagine what could happen if this was the norm. Mr. N.D. Tiwari, for instance, would get off quite easily, wouldn't he? I mean, it would be somebody else. Yeah. So instances such as this appear time and again in this case. A post-mortem report, the final document in anyone's life. A post-mortem report, in this instance, changes 6 times after it's first written, over a period of 2.5 years. My question is that as consumers of what we call the system, we blame it a lot, as consumers of this system, is this all right by us? Should we not know about it a little more? I mean, is it fine? If it's fine, then let's codify it. Let's just say, no, it is not the final document. You can change it at will whenever you want if you're an investigator. The integrity of forensic evidence, for instance, without a court order, you can't open if, for instance, this bottle of water was sealed by a forensic lab without the express permission of a court. You cannot, under any circumstances, unseal this to take stuff out. One day in court when I was there, 56 samples of forensic evidence were brought in. And each of them was opened. Not one of them had its seal on. So where is the integrity of that forensic evidence? And how do we then even measure the kind of proof or otherwise that was there? I hear a phrase constantly repeated about the Aarushi case, and that is that the investigation was botched. Yes, of course it was botched. But botched, in my mind, is a euphemism. It's a mild word. What was going on here was far greater than botched. What was going on here was a deliberate and malign attempt to frame two people. The unfairness of what went on in the Aarushi case lies there, partly. I could go on.
I know. It's very scary what you're saying, actually. And the book goes over the evidence and documents which we did not know earlier with a very fine-tooth comb. And it's all there.
Just for the benefit of the audience, I mean, one of the things perhaps you're talking about is
the results of the
narco-analysis.
Yes, exactly,
I think you were sort of about to allude to that.
Exactly.
So let's be clear about one thing. Narco-analysis tests or any scientific tests are not acceptable as evidence on the face of it. They are instead tools of investigation. For instance, if a person, and there's a good reason why, and I support that reason, why this is not evidence, because some of these tests, at least the truth serum test, which everybody in this case had to undergo, it jeopardizes one other fundamental right of yours, which is the right not to incriminate yourself. I support that right. Just as a citizen, I support that right. So I feel that, yes, to that extent, you should not be dependent on a truth serum report or whatever it is as evidence to convict someone. However, they are and still remain valuable tools of investigation. You could, for instance, through the narration of the person undergoing the test, find a murder weapon, some piece of hard evidence.
Which you can then go
and see. And in fact, in the narco analysis, and let me put it this way, it's not the isolated case of just the narco being used. There's a range of tests. These range from polygraph, which many of you are familiar with, to something called brain mapping, where you can measure through fairly accurate science. I say fairly because it's not accepted everywhere in the world. Whether a person experienced something or whether he was merely told about it. So if a person is indeed there at the scene of a crime, then he will return a result of having experiential knowledge. It's not about them being told.
You feed them statements and see how they react.
So that's really it. And since we are talking about psychology, I mean, in a way we are, one of the things that behavioral scientists have found over the years is that people who are, this is a sort of a gross generalization, but in general, let's just, as a thumb rule, people who may have been involved in a crime directly often cast themselves as witnesses to the crime rather than the actual players. Second, to do with the narco once again, what had happened was 13 consecutive tests on all of these people. They returned a finding that these people, the other three, were indeed there in the flat. Right. If you accept that for a moment, if you think about it as a line of investigation, then what happens is the whole story of a closed-door murder with the simple math of 4 people in the house, 2 dead, so the 2 alive must know or must have done it, that falls apart.
Absolutely.
Now, I know this is a mathematically minded city, but so the chance of 13 consecutive tests, the linear chance of 13 consecutive tests returning a result such as that is actually about 1 out of 4,000. So in terms of reasonable doubt, there is a more than 99% reasonable doubt. And one of the offshoots or discussions about the case done in newspaper uses this to say, well, we're talking here of the 99% chance of others being in that flat at that time. Does that not raise reasonable doubt about whether these people indeed committed the murders or no?
Right. Scientific tests returned negative results on the talwars, but somehow, somewhere along the line, how did it become a crime based on character study and not on evidence? Tell me something. Number one, why was Nupur Talwar not arrested at the first instance? Why was only Rajesh Talwar arrested? Is it because of the perception that mothers don't kill and fathers might?
I think the history of mankind tells you that fathers, mothers, children, brothers, sisters, everyone kills. There are no exceptions. And it's foolish to say that as a class of society or as a kind of person, we are immune to some kind of crime. No, we are not. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing to say. To answer specifically why Nupur Talwar was not part of the suspect list to begin with, the simple answer to that question is that the story was not yet in place. This story comes into play 2 years after the murders, where they find that if this is a scenario that we're looking at, the father killing the daughter in a fit of rage, and all of this, there's pools of blood all over the place, and one body down, one body on the terrace, then this person must need an accomplice. And who do we have? There were 4 people in the house. 2 are alive. So both must have been involved. So Nupur Talwar actually is charged only about 2.5, 3 years after the original, the
Beginning
the case.
of 2011, I think the charge sheet names her as an accused.
That's
as
right.
well.
And that comes out of an interesting phrase that's used a lot. And it's, in fact, it's so interesting. It's extremely popular in all drawing rooms that discuss this case. This is dressing up of the crime scene. I don't know whether it's someone understanding that women dress up a crime scene better than men. But if it is, that's unfortunate. But this is how it came about. And that is when Nupur Talwar came into the case. The interesting thing, and since we're talking about her, Nupur Talwar is a key factor in the conviction of the Talwars, regardless of the evidence.
I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
The fact of her television appearance, 25th May, was it?
Yeah, but that date, I mean, the most important thing to remember here is that one of the conduct issues that you spoke about, and conduct is everything in a case where there is no evidence. It shouldn't be, but that's how it is. But one of the issues that came up after Nupur Talwar appeared on television is that there was widespread disbelief, and I think she was derided or she was vilified for not having wept on television. Now, it turns out that actually, while she didn't break down on the set, she tried very hard, in fact, not to break down. And the moment that interview was over and the cameras had stopped rolling, she did indeed cry a lot. But
it did become Aarushi, or the case of the mother who did not cry.
Who did not cry. So this disregards, I think, something which is otherwise quite easy to grasp, that not all of us grieve in the same way. It would be quite strange if that happened. Also, not all of us can as is expected sometimes by people, to be grieving or to be crying for 12 hours at a stretch. So the case made out in one way was that she doesn't cry on television, doesn't cry at home. She just doesn't cry, therefore she must be guilty. Now, this leap of logic leaves something quite important behind. In between it is the evidence you're supposed to supply.
She doesn't
for
fit
the
the
crime
stereotype
itself.
of the mother.
She doesn't fit the stereotype. So the Talwars, in many ways, and this is a societal part of it, stood out or stood apart from all of us in the way that they were cast as what we call the other, the kind of people who we really don't want to mix with, the kind of people who indulge in something like, say, wife swapping or wild orgies or have extramarital affairs. Therefore, they're a really disturbed, unhappy, deviant family who would naturally, spawn a child. Like, say, Aarushi, who would in turn go and have consensual sex with whoever she wants to and all of that. This casting of the Talwars is something that, first and foremost, the CBI did very well with plants or with leaks to media, which were reported verbatim as if someone was taking stenography. So the journalists failed there. But the story itself, I think the problem with this was that once this was done, nobody in the reading or viewing public also seemed to question it with any degree of skepticism. So that's really how it played out. And Nupur Talwar was at the center of it because she seemed to be the person manipulating. The second thing about her is that our constabulary, policemen, there's an underlying misogyny in the way these things take place, or who we are in, at least in that department. And when faced with a strong woman, I think what happens automatically is that the positions taken are adversarial. That does not help any line of investigation ever, because it's a personal dislike for somebody. And this would come up not just during the investigation, but also during the trial. So at many levels, the fact that she didn't cry or the fact that she spoke her mind and was strong, all of these things were held against her. And with tragic consequences, yeah.
I mean, if even a dead 13-year-old isn't spared character assassination, I wouldn't really expect it for Nupur Talwar, should we?
No. So one of the things that, the question that I get asked once in a while by people is that my book details the track record of some of the people investigating the case. And one man in particular, a gentleman who was finally the chief investigator, had a recorded history of unscrupulous investigation. He was caught bribing or trying to bribe witnesses. He was through his career, in fact, on a very secret list held by the CBI. They don't allow us to know about it because it doesn't come under the purview of RTI. This is a list of officers of doubtful integrity. Such a list does exist within the CBI. He was always on it. Just coincidentally, the day that I finished my manuscript, this man passed away. And I was then asked on several things, how were you speaking ill of the dead? My answer to that is actually quite straightforward, is that none of us is obliged to do that, actually. Whether you're alive or dead, I think the work that you've done is what is being talked about, not you per se. So I remove myself from that argument that way. But I posed a counter question. I said, well, it was this man, remember, who spoke about a 13-year-old girl in ways which were unimaginable. Wasn't she dead? So why is it that we can do it for some people and not for others? Doesn't that strike you as strange? So yeah.
time now, I think, to turn Avirook to the great Indian mind and ask for
Absolutely,
some
Manu.
questions. Questions, please.
Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, because this is something that, being an educated person, I felt that whatever the media showed us was right. Only your perspective gave us the right perspective as to what happened. Thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you. One. Number two, I want to ask you is, we've understood everything, we've heard everything. As a lay person, whatever I was told, I told you that I believed in what you told me. Why is it that today, after hearing everything, nobody from our ministers, nobody from the media, nobody from anywhere wants to do anything? The man who was killed by because he ate beef, Rahul Gandhi goes to his house. This little girl has died. I have kids at home, and I'm only in that fear that if I'm living in a country where something so black and white has been told and nothing has been happening to it, what is it? I mean, like, what is happening? I want to know.
Thank you for the question. It's a complex question, so I'll try and answer it as coherently as possible. One of the things about this case is that for people to get involved in it, let me just answer the first part of it. Why is it no one doing anything at all in the more, let's say, the more official way, which is that, see, there's a 3-tier system in our judiciary which is in place. Mistakes committed by the lower judiciary can be corrected in the appellate court. So, us being conservative and overall status quo is, we say, well, they have the opportunity to go and do that, so they should be doing it. But beyond doing something, when you say, why is it that no one else or the general public or people like that, it's untrue to say that nothing's happened. Nothing's happened materially to benefit the Talwars, perhaps, but there have been voices raised on all of that. That's been happening. However, there is one thing about this case which doesn't have a clear-cut political angle to it. So the politician will be hesitant to get involved. But what it hasn't been able to do, or what we as the media haven't been able to do, is communicate that the gravity of this case is not about, these specific victims or these people who face a grave miscarriage of justice. It's not about them. That it could happen to you. This sense hasn't been communicated well enough by people like us. And that's why your question arises in the first place. But thank you for the question anyway.
Yes.
Hi. Okay.
No, you have been suggesting that the general public, or let's say a person like me,
Yes, sir.
did not protest against it, so that things are being done, and we have been following. But today, you see, in the media, whatever is given, we don't know whichever it is, whether it is true or not. What comes in the newspaper, we don't know. So, at least for me, I don't have any means to find out what is the truth and what is not the truth. And it is in a justice. And I may have a feeling it is not correct, but I don't have any means to say that it is not correct. In that case, my question is, this is only one case, I am not telling, but in general, how do you propose a general public opinion, how they can come up so that the truth comes out? That is my question.
So I think it's actually, I could give it's a fairly brief answer to this, and this cuts across everything, which is that if we use the faculty of rationality that I think we're all blessed with, in being skeptical about what we read or what we hear or what we choose to disseminate as journalists, then half the job is done. Some of the mistakes or some of the gross errors in this case are so obvious, an 8-year-old would understand. So really, for us to accept all of this garbage is in itself, I would say, on the part of the journalist, definitely, there's a laziness to it. But also on the part of the reader And I include myself in both categories. I'm both a disseminator of news and a consumer of news, in both categories. So really, if we just use the faculty of reasoning to a greater degree than we perhaps have, wonderful things can happen.
Right.
Hi. I just needed to know, as a journalist, where do you see this going? Because I have heard not a lot of hope in the case going to the Allahabad High Court, because UP is a different ballgame altogether. So then you have a legal system which is likely to fail again, and you also have a media which is not really doing all it should be doing to bring this case up. So what is your take on it, given that you've been so closely associated? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
That once it goes to trial, it's a long waiting list, isn't it?
no, I mean, the trial is actually over. It'll go in appeal. Anyway, it's a good question once again. It's a valid question. And there are two things about it which are significant, I think. The first is that because of the kind of attention that the case has got, it has a possibility of jumping the queue of cases that are pending in Allahabad. Appeals from the 80s are still being heard in that High Court. Now, that said, even if it does go there, the fear or the apprehension that I think your question expresses, because it's only an extension of the same system, that I'm not able to actually, tell you, sitting here, that no, let's not hold on to that. Please do hold on to the apprehension. I'll tell you a story why. When this couple applied for bail in the Allahabad High Court, one of the grounds for bail is that we won't repeat the crime. We are otherwise, law-abiding citizens, and their defense counsel stands up and says we won't repeat the crime. The judge in the High Court, in full, as when the court was full, tells the defendants, tells the Talwar, that, well, clearly you cannot repeat the crime because you had only one daughter and you've killed her. Now, to hear something like this in a courtroom suggests straight away that perhaps we should look a little harder at some of our institutions. Because this is not a magistrate with 3 months training who somehow rises to become what he is and feels that he can exercise, as I call it, the tyranny of petty authority. But it's a High Court judge. So I too, ma'am, just like you, am a little worried. But I haven't lost all faith, if that's the question. I think in the end it's going to be corrected.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, and a very good evening to bring me the 70-year-old fellow. So I like to ask you, you mentioned the narcotics.
So speak into the mic, please, if you can.
I like to question you, sir. Just now you uttered both about the narcotics and DNA test.
Right.
Yeah? And in the case of N.D. Tiwari,
Could you hold your mic up, please?
and in the case of Mr. N.D. Tiwari and that,
Right.
previously it was given something and that was proved, and his, what is called the illegitimate son, was given the rights by the court. So in this case, you mentioned this narcotic test and DNA test, whatever is the change or the thing. Have you, sir, mentioned in your book there is a way? It is all, everybody knows that. There is lots of different, so many cases that the altered things. So we poor people, we cannot change this scientific also. So everybody knows, even the judges know, even the judges of the Supreme Court know that this case is contradictory.
Okay.
So have you put your writing in the book, the way in which it is to be clarified to the
You mean have I offered a solution to this?
Yeah.
No, the solution actually is quite simple. follow procedure, follow the rules, don't flout what's already there, and you will have a fair trial or a fair system. Why commit fraud? Why forge documents? Why do all of that? So that's to answer your. Yeah.
One last question.
Hi, Avirook. Thank you. I've read your book and I've followed it very closely, and that's what brings me here. What I have is not so much of a question, more of a talking point. Like you explained at the beginning of the session, that there is a class divide that we have to be cognizant to. Quite contrary to most of the cases that you would see, that here it is the people from the other side of the class who somewhat have gotten off, while people who were otherwise, who you would have thought maybe more influential or have political connections or so what. So it's sort of interesting because obviously you've considered every angle in your book and I've followed it closely, so there's no new ground to be broken here. But it's sort of interesting to note that it is these servants who you would have thought that did not have enough political mileage have actually tend to, in some way, obviously I'm sort of assuming that they were the guilty ones and not the Talwars, going with that narration, is that they are the ones who sort of benefited. And obviously there's no political mileage to be had out of this case. Is probably not why it's not getting the necessary attention it should have. So that's one of the observations that I have had, and it's just if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's once again valid observation, but very briefly, the thing to look at first when you're looking at a murder or a trial or this kind of thing, something that's appeared in court, is evidence. And I mean, the altar of evidence is cold. It's not an emotional place at all. It's a place in which all of these, what religion, what class, what caste you are, become irrelevant. And what you have as fact or record becomes important. I mean, that's basically what it is. So that's how the approach should be, in my view. That's how you should approach something like this.
In fact, I would like to ask something.
Yes. Our last question, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon.
Yes.
In fact, your narration has been excellent. I tell you, the way you have narrated psychologically, methodically, programming and all. I have two things to ask. In fact, first panel they were talking about development in India. India has developed, people talk about like in 10, 15 years, 20 years. Our ancestors, they have not done anything for us. That's what the feeling we come. No. This new generation, they are totally insecure. They don't know where to go. It is parents, they have to guide them. If you don't guide them properly, then Mary Aarushi can't will be there. See, basically parents, they are socializing, they are having affairs, they are having so many activities. That is very well perceived by the next generation. They observe you. If they do anything wrong, they are doing because they are getting inspiration from you. But one thing I just want to know, like Peter Mukherjee case, then this Aarushi case, they just go on for 2-3 months like TRP, in some system. After that, they die away.
Stop watching them.
No. What is the ultimate thing? What is the ultimate thing? Morning you read the newspaper.
So I have a couple of points of disagreements with you, in fact. One is that in this particular case, the example set by the parents was not that different from what we would expect from a reasonable, good, middle-class household.
Anyway, thank you very much.
So I mean, I maybe you see in your environment many people of this type that you describe,
anyway,
and that's fine. We have to live with everyone. So that should answer it, I think.
Anyway, thanks a lot. I'll just go through your book. If I have anything, I'll just mail you.
Sure.
And the gentleman at the back has been waiting, so that will be the last question.
So my question is actually based on common sense. Your speech, from your talk, it seems that modern technology is available to get the truth out of from witnesses like narco tests and truth tests, etc. Then why is the police, you regularly hear of using third degree when technology is available to get the correct information from witnesses? Why is third degree used?
third degree is slightly acceptable. Technology is not in the system. But that's, no, to treat your question with the seriousness it deserves. So the point is that we should understand that tests such as the narco or the polygraph or the others that I mentioned are really merely tools of investigation. They are not evidence. So this is a clear understanding. That's the law of our country. However, in front-loading an investigation or in creating the impression that so-and-so is guilty, this is used regularly. I mean, in the Aarushi case, the narco tests or all of these tests were never touched as even tools, forget evidence in court, never even, never touched. However, in Peter Mukherjee's case, for instance, 3-4 days ago, there was a news report saying that his polygraph suggests that he knew about the murder of Sheena Bora. So really, it is the selective use or abuse of these tools by individuals and agencies that create the problem. I mean, the cleanup or whatever it is has to come really from within. I mean, people have to realize that the idea of fairness, of a fair trial, or the idea of good procedure isn't something terribly new or exceptional, that this is the way really it has to be done. And if you don't do it, you will occasionally get called out like they were in the Aarushi case.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being such a responsive audience. And most of you will have read the book anyway. Those of you who have not will, I'm sure, start reading it from this evening on. At the book signing, please get your copy and get it signed. He's going to be there shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.